to U.S. President Donald Trump's latest round of tariffs. While countries like Canada say they're working to negotiate better trade deals with the U.S. president, Trump is doubling down on the use of tariffs as a way to boost the U.S. economy.
You know, Prime Minister Carney is trying his best, but this guy will say something one day, and he'll wake up, and the cheese slips off the cracker, and then all of a sudden he goes the other way. And you're thinking, how do you deal with a guy like this?
It began like a power play. Trump believed Canada would fold under pressure the way smaller players often do when the White House turns up the heat. First came the warnings and the public jabs, and finally the threat that Canada's position on Palestinian statehood could freeze any trade deal in its tracks. Ottawa didn't flinch. Instead, it dug in, waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment came when Mark Carney quietly turned the game around, leaving Trump on the defensive. The tariff stayed, the tension grew, and the tables shifted. In the end, the deal he thought he could dictate slipped through his hands. Was this a trade standoff or something deeper? And what does it reveal about the real balance of power between Washington and Ottawa? Let's dig in. Trump's threat came without warning. Hours before his self-imposed deadline for new tariffs against Canada, he reached for his favorite weapon. And after midnight social media post, it wasn't a statement from the Oval Office or a formal diplomatic message. It was a blunt shot fired into the public square, declaring that Canada's support for Palestinian statehood would make a trade deal very hard to reach. No back-channel talks, no quiet diplomacy, only a public attempt at humiliation. This was never about trade alone. Other allies had taken similar positions, yet none faced the same retaliation. France, the UK, Mexico untouched.
Carney, however, did not bend. There were no phone calls seeking forgiveness, no public attempts to soothe the president's ego. Instead, Canada stood by its position, making decisions grounded in principle.
On American approval, that quiet defiance cracked Trump's image of control, and his response was to turn trade negotiations into a stage for personal revenge. Carney, however, did not bend. There were no phone calls seeking forgiveness, no public attempts to soothe the president's ego. Instead, Canada stood by its position, making decisions grounded in principle. Trump's frustration was plain. On camera, he accused Canada of treating American farmers very badly and repeated claims of massive tariffs, some over 200%. He spoke of protecting Canada with U.S. military power, implying that such defense should grant him the right to dictate economic terms. To him, sovereignty was a commodity to be bought and sold. The facts told another story. Canada and the United States share one of the most balanced and deeply integrated trade relationships in the world. Tariffs are not arbitrary weapons, but negotiated under existing agreements. Trump's portrayal of Canada as an explorer ignored decades of mutual benefits. The attacks weren't about correcting trade imbalances. They were about manufacturing an enemy. And this time, the villain he chose was a neighboring democracy bound to him by history, geography, and economic ties. Carney's refusal to flinch drew sharp contrast to Trump's approach. While the U.S. president wielded fear and intimidation, Canada relied on steady policy and public reassurance. The message was simple. Sovereignty is not negotiable. Trump may have expected a rapid concession, but what he encountered was resistance built on confidence and preparation. The timing of his threats also collided with a weakening domestic picture. That week's job numbers came in below expectations, and a revision of previous months erased nearly 260,000 jobs from official counts. Economists pointed directly to tariff uncertainty as the reason businesses were holding back on hiring. The president's trade war was cutting into his own economy rather than address the cause. He blamed statisticians for the data, accusing them of rigging the numbers. When a leader responds to evidence by attacking the messenger, it signals not strength but instability. Canada, watching this unfold, saw an opportunity to reinforce its own path. While Trump used tariffs as a blunt instrument, Canada began investing in industries of home, steel, aluminum, and manufacturing, ensuring they were fueled by Canadian labor and resources. International interest in trade with Canada grew with foreign governments and businesses eager to strengthen partnerships. Carney's vision was not about striking back at Trump, but about making Canada less vulnerable to American volatility. This approach underscored a truth. Economic resilience is built through independence. Canada was proving that it could expand its prosperity, without waiting for Washington's moods to shift. Every time Carney rejected a bad deal, he reinforced the principle that Canada's agreements must respect its autonomy. The strategy wasn't loud or confrontational. It was deliberate and it was working. Trump, in contrast, seemed driven less by policy than by control. He sought not mutual agreements, but arrangements that placed Canada in a subordinate role. It was the same logic used in his business dealings. Power over partners, not partnership itself. Carney's unshaken stance turned that playbook useless. This standoff was also about endurance. Trump counted on fatigue, hoping Canada would tire of the constant threats and eventually concede. Carney counted on persistence, knowing that steady resolve could outlast unpredictable fury. As Canadian officials explained, sovereignty must be exercised or remain strong like muscle that weakens if used. By standing firm, Canada was not only defending a single policy decision, but reinforcing the foundation of its independence. Even the trade landscape itself was not as vulnerable as Trump claimed. Thanks to the updated trade agreement, Canada had secured exemptions shielding nearly 90% of its exports to the United States from blanket tariffs.
In the end, Trump had set out to teach Canada a lesson about power. What he demonstrated instead was how little that power could achieve against a prepared and determined partner.
Europe and Japan faced broader tariff exposure. Canada had already locked in safeguards. This meant that Trump's threats, while loud, carried far less practical impact. The U.S. could impose certain tariffs, but the bulk of Canadian exports were already insulated. The very architecture of the agreement Trump had touted contained provisions that weakened his own leverage. His advisors acknowledged the strength of these exemptions, even as he continued to portray Canada as vulnerable. Carney had turned the supposed weapon into something closer to a bluff. By focusing on preparation rather than provocation, Canada had ensured that even in the face of aggressive rhetoric, the damage would be minimal. The contrast between the two leaders could not have been sharper. One relying on social media blasts and public ultimatums, the other on quiet strategy and long-term planning. As the days passed, the pressure campaign began to look less like negotiation and more like theater. Trump's threats no longer rattled Ottawa. They had become background noise. Canada's course was set toward building new alliances and strengthening internal capacity. The more the U.S. tried to destabilize, the more Canada's resolve became a demonstration of stability itself. In the end, Trump had set out to teach Canada a lesson about power. What he demonstrated instead was how little that power could achieve against a prepared and determined partner. The midnight posts, the public accusations, the exaggerated claims of unfair treatment, all of it failed to deliver the submission he sought. Canada's trade defenses held. Its economy kept building, and its leadership emerged from the confrontation with greater credibility on the world stage. Trump threatened Canada with economic fire, but forgot to check if they were already fireproof. Furthermore, President Trump has been very vocal about his disapproval of Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell, a man he personally appointed during his first term. In recent months, that criticism has turned into open pressure, urging Powell to slash interest rates or step down entirely. The latest twist came with news that Federal Reserve Governor Adriana Kalula will be resigning, creating a vacancy that Trump could fill with someone aligned with his economic instincts and political goals. That vacancy could position him to install Powell's eventual replacement, handing the White House influence over an institution that was designed to remain independent of partisan control. While the headlines focus on trade disputes, this quiet maneuvering has even greater implications. Trump has already removed labor commissioners, reshaped regulatory boards, and targeted those producing economic data he doesn't like. Now, his reach is extending toward the Federal Reserve itself. This isn't about improving economic conditions. It's about controlling the scoreboard. The risk extends far beyond the United States. If the Fed becomes an extension of political power, the ripple effects could destabilize markets around the globe. In Ottawa, the warning is clear. That's why Prime Minister Mark Carney's long-term push to diversify Canada's trading partnerships is more than patriotic posturing. It is an essential safeguard against volatility coming from the South. Trump is reshaping the U.S. economy to serve his image, Carney is reinforcing Canada's.
Carney didn't exchange sovereignty for relief. He built protections into the framework itself, ensuring resilience no matter the political climate in Washington. The existence of these carve-outs explains why Trump's anger toward Canada has been more personal and less predictable than his disputes.
258,000 positions from the official count. May saw only 19,000 jobs added. June just 14,000. Numbers that pale against the usual monthly range of 100,000 to 200,000. Markets reacted quickly, sliding throughout the day as investors absorbed the scale of the miss. And even Trump's own economic advisors admitted their policies had disrupted markets and upended hiring. The president's tariff battles billed as a pathway to manufacturing revival have instead accelerated job losses at home. For Trump, this collapse isn't only economic, it's political. He believed he could force other nations into concessions while keeping the U.S. economy insulated from consequences. That illusion has now been stripped away by the data. Removing the Bureau of Labor Statistics chief won't erase the reality that the trade war is hurting the very workers it claimed to protect. When leaders retaliate against the truth instead of confronting the problem, it reveals panic, not strength. Canada, by contrast, didn't lash out at bad numbers or attempt to rewrite reality. Carney's approach was to accept the challenges, plan around them, and keep moving toward stability. The United States is losing leverage as its labor market weakens. Canada, protected by strategic agreements and diversified trade, is gaining it. This advantage becomes clearer when comparing tariff impacts. Europe and Japan recently agreed to deals with the U.S. that carry a 15% blanket tariff on nearly all their exports. Canada's arrangement is very different through exemptions secured under the updated customer agreement. Nearly 90% of Canadian exports to the U.S. face no tariff at all, even under Trump's new threats. While the EU and Japan face a broad, immediate tax on goods, Canada has an economic shield that covers most of its trade. This is not the result of luck. It is the product of calculated negotiation. Carney didn't exchange sovereignty for relief. He built protections into the framework itself.
The job data that should have been a political victory for Trump instead became a public defeat. July brought only 73,000 new jobs, far below projections. But the real blow was the revision of May and June's figures, cutting another 258,000 from the total. For any economy, such losses over a short period signal deep structural problems. For an administration that built its narrative on economic success, it's devastating. These are not abstract statistics. They represent families without income, skilled workers without a place to apply their abilities, and communities absorbing the shock of reduced demand. The causes are not hidden.
The flash of a pen in front of cameras. Many of the arrangements he's announced with other countries have yet to produce signed enforceable terms. In that gap between performance and reality, Canada has quietly advanced its own position. Carney's strategy has never relied on dramatic announcements. His focus has been protection for key industries, stability for workers, and trade architecture that will outlast the headlines. That difference in style reflects a difference in priorities. Trump responds to immediate impulses and political optics. Carney responds to the broader horizon. Canadians, regardless of party, value leadership that defends national interests without bending to foreign pressure. Foreign policy decisions are made for Canadian reasons, not as a concession to American demands. That independence is precisely what draws Trump's frustration. He expects submission and reacts with anger when he encounters sovereignty instead. Over the course of the standoff, Trump has misjudged the value of endurance. His method is to exhaust opponents through constant threats, assuming fatigue will eventually force them to yield. Carney's method is to hold steady until the storm passes, ensuring that any agreement reached is one worth signing. This isn't stubbornness for its own sake. It's the understanding that national rights like muscle grow weaker if they aren't exercised. And the economic reality makes the contrast even sharper.